In here. So, a little introduction. I'm Darius Houle. I work at Trail of Bits, and little background. So this talks about code signing, code integrity. It's about sort of the relevance and offensive security. And the way I'm going to kind of talk about it is I found a vulnerability in the Electron framework last year. So Electron framework, for anyone not familiar, built on top of Chrome and V8. And it's a desktop app framework that allows people to kind of build apps using technologies they know and love in the web ecosystem. And yeah, so let's talk about kind of code signing, integrity, and what that means in that ecosystem for an offensive security professional, right? So I'm going to start right off the bat with kind of some interesting stuff. I have a video for you here. And once again, hopefully, I can get this working easily. Perfect. So I have a video here, and what I have for you essentially is I have a copy of 1Password here, and I'm going to show you kind of a couple no tricks up my sleeve things. I'm going to show you that I have, with Microsoft Signing Tool, not modified this binary, and it's by a trusted author. I'm also going to show you that it has a couple integrity checking features provided by the Electron framework enabled that together essentially mean the binary shouldn't be tampered with, and the scripts it loads shouldn't be tampered with. But with no JavaScript sideloading potentially being possible, can we work around that? The answer is yes. I'm going to copy over what appears to be kind of an inert file sitting next to 1Password, and we're going to sideload some JavaScript. And the next time I start 1Password here, it's going to look a little bit different. Yay! So very fun, right? So the context here really is you shouldn't be able to do that. Why shouldn't you be able to do that? What does that mean for someone with less than altruistic intentions, right? So that's kind of the fun part up front here. Let's get into the rest of the presentation from there. So some of the details then. Some of the details then, so let's kind of frame up the discussion with a little bit of background. That shouldn't have been possible, right? And it comes down to the first couple points on this slide here. Code signing, code integrity, and in plain English, really, like, what that means is like when you run a program on your Windows computer, you should know the author, you should trust the author, and it shouldn't be tampered with. And, being able to circumvent that is impactful. Right. So I'm going to give you a couple examples on why I think that's the case. So the first one, kind of bear with me. Imagine you're an activist, a whistleblower, a journalist, something like that. You use Signal for private communication. You're looking to download a copy of Signal Desktop. And in doing so, and I know everyone's done this, you click, like, say, a sponsored ad in Google search or something like that. You end up on a site that looks like a legitimate Signal download site, but you download a bootleg copy of Signal. The app that you download looks like Signal, works like Signal. It's signed by the Signal team, and it's passing its integrity checks. You are in kind of a scary situation at that point. How do you know that you're running a legitimate piece of software? And for something, as an example that protects the privacy of, journalists, whistleblowers, activists, right? It's not something you really want to compromise on. The other example I would kind of bring up here is, more typically, like, say an attacker has, a foothold on your machine. They have other goals to execute on. They want to establish persistence on your machine, continue, operating there. Well, they may choose to backdoor an application that's already on your machine, something that you rely on, and that is a very stealthy way for them to operate. Most of what they need to fly under the radar comes for free, right? So, a little bit of background in place. Let's talk about kind of the anatomy of a user-installed Electron application. So, talk about kind of what protections you get when you run a typical app, what you don't, and I'm going to focus a little bit on Windows here. There's discussion to be had on other platforms, obviously, as well, but the highest impact on Windows, so this is kind of where I focused. So typical user-installed Windows applications, most of you are going to be familiar with a folder called App Data. It's owned by you, and it's where programs that you install without elevation end up. This is a very common pattern with Electron. And when you run an app folder, you have a certain amount of operating systems. You have one, but at the bare minimum, out of the box, you're going to get those basic checks on knowing the author and knowing it hasn't been tampered with on the binary level. But the last point on this slide here is something important. Now, your application's logic, like its JavaScript and any interpreted code, right? That has to be protected by the application itself. So you're not going to get that with the operating system for free. So you are in charge of making sure your scripted app logic is not tampered with. And there's a lot of solutions to that problem. One I brought up in a bullet point here is like MSIX packaging. And that's essentially like a good way to work around that. But the one we're going to focus on is a little bit more the latter. Electron framework provided integrity checking controls themselves. So let's get into that a little bit more and talk about after the OS verifies your binary and says, okay, you're good to load, let's talk about what Electron can do for you to make sure that your JavaScript, your application logic hasn't been tampered with, right? So you have a couple things to turn on in the form of what are called fuses. They're basically just feature flags. Enable embedded ASAR integrity validation and only load app from ASAR. Now, I only put those in the presentation. But not to say, in short, if you enable these two fuses, you say, hey, Electron, when you're building my app, store all your scripts in a single place, store it in an archive called an ASAR, only run the scripts from that single place, and make sure they haven't been tampered with before you run. And basically, between that binary level checking you get from the OS and the script level checking you get from Electron, you should have some pretty good protection against tampering being performed against your application. But big asterisks here, by default, those fuses are not on. You as the developer have to decide, I want my scripts to be protected. So that's kind of interesting, right? At that point, if you don't turn those on, which is by the default, you essentially are making a binary signed by you that effectively runs any JavaScript an attacker would like. And as it turns out, there's a whole lot of apps out there that'll happily execute whatever JavaScript is sitting right next to them. So you may recognize the logo on the right-hand side there. And at that point, they are proxy executors, which essentially means they can, using the trust that they have built in, they can execute completely untrusted code, right? So I have an example on the screen here of an app that takes kind of full advantage of that fact, especially in the that's a command and control suite called Loki C2, hat tip to Bobby Cook. It's pretty dang full-featured, and it gets pretty much all of its stealthiness by and no one's planning on patching that out. So, all kinds of shenanigans, like exfiltrating every fetch that goes to Coinbase, for instance, right here. So, big picture, I think it's time to revisit that part of the Chrome threat model. App packaging, especially on Windows, has come a long way since a lot of the core assumptions have been made. And I don't really think it's true anymore that that code running as you does as you do. I know that's kind of like a controversial take, but what I would say is go download the latest version of 1Password. It's now MSIX packaged instead. Try to do the same snapshot clobbering attack on it now, and tell me how it goes. What you're going to run into is a permission model that doesn't allow for this kind of attack to take place anymore. So I'll also point out, this is kind of interesting. When it comes to the Chrome security FAQ, they actually already implement a lot of local security controls, right? Like one that I would draw a really interesting comparison to is extensions. When you run Chrome, it integrity checks your extensions before it allows your extensions to be loaded every time. So I can't tamper with an extension on disk, but if I can tamper with the heap snapshot that gets loaded in the extension, you've got kind of like an inconsistency in the security model right there, right? So that's kind of interesting, right? So that's kind of the end of the part where I talk about the abuse scenarios. For anyone on the builder side of the house, someone trying to secure these kinds of apps, what do you take away on that side of the house, right? A few high-level takeaways. Don't skimp on your local threat model. If you handle sensitive data especially, you have a responsibility to think about how an attacker is going to use and abuse your app. And really, your bare minimum is just code signing and integrity checking all of the code that makes up your app, not just the binary, your whole app logic, right? Use your OS best practices, use your framework best practices, use your policy to your advantage when you're talking about shared library loads, right? And lastly, kind of think about what you're storing as user writable data. That one's very critical for this vulnerability that I reported, right? Think about how an attacker might abuse that to make your app a proxy executor, right? And for anyone using Electron specifically, obviously, turn on the fuses. It's not going to do it by default. Use a modern packaging format if you have one available to you. You're going to start seeing more and more Electron apps packaged with this MSIX packaging format because you get that isolation, integrity checking, and default kind of safety out of the box, right? And just a couple parting thoughts. This is sort of the tip of the iceberg to me. There are way too many ways to package an app. There's way too many integrity checking foot guns. And there's probably a ton of other stealth proxy executors out there that are just waiting to be reported, right? And that's what I'm going to keep doing next. I will probably keep finding and documenting interesting persistence avenues. And I'll do a little hat tip to LOL Apps here by John Jackson. This is a really cool platform for documenting this exact type of flaw. And if you're familiar with LOLBAS or anything like that, it's in the same universe as that. So yeah, keep an eye. Maybe there'll be some cool submissions soon, right? I'll take a quick moment here too, just to say, a big shout out to the Electron team, 1Password, Signal, Slack. They were all awesome to work with. They took it very seriously. They patched this flaw pretty much immediately. And with that, I'm going to wrap here. So thank you everyone for listening to me talk, and come find me later if you want to chat on it more.